continents. Research in Africa exemplifies the pushing back of archaeology's frontiers in both time and space. The quest for human origins has been one success story, but so too has been the rediscovery through archaeology of the achievements and history of the Iron Age peoples of Africa, including the building of Great Zimbabwe. By 1970, archaeological technology for the whole continent was sufficiently advanced for J. Desmond Clark, one of the leading researchers, to produce the first synthesis, The Prehistory of Africa. Meanwhile, in another equally little-studied continent, Australia, John Mulvaney's excavations in the early 1960s at Kenneth Cave, South Queensland, produced radiocarbon dates proving occupation there during the last phase of the Ice Age, thus establishing Australasia as one of the most fruitful regions for new archaeological research in the world. Work in Australia highlights two further important trends in modern archaeology: the rise of ethnoarchaeology and the intensifying global debate about who should control or own monuments and ideas about the past. The living past. From its beginnings, the new archaeology placed great emphasis on explanation, explaining how the archaeological record was formed and what excavated structures and artifacts might mean in terms of human behavior. It came to be realized that one of the most effective ways of addressing such questions would be to study the material culture and behavior of living societies. Ethnographic observation itself was nothing new. Anthropologists had studied the Native Americans and Australian Aborigines since the 19th century. What was new was the archaeological focus. The new name, ethnoarchaeology or living archaeology, emphasized this. The work of Richard Gould among the Aborigines in Australia, Richard Lee among the Kung San of southern Africa, and Louis Binford among the Nunamiut Eskimo has established ethnoarchaeology, discussed in more detail in Chapter 5, as one of the most significant recent developments in the whole discipline. However, the increasing involvement of archaeologists with living societies, and the simultaneous rise among such societies of an awareness of their own heritage and their claims to it, has raised the question of who should have access to, or ownership of, the past. It is clear, for example, that the only inhabitants of Australia before European settlement were the Aborigines. Should the Aborigines themselves therefore control archaeological work on their forebears, even those dating back 20,000 years or more? This important issue is explored further in Chapter 14. Archaeologists such as John Mulvaney and Rhys Jones have stood shoulder to shoulder with the Aborigines in the fight to prevent destruction by developers of parts of Australia's precious ancient heritage, for instance in Tasmania. Inevitably, though, as the pace of worldwide economic development has quickened, archaeologists everywhere have had to adapt and learn to salvage what they can about the past in advance of the bulldozer or plow. Indeed, the massive upsurge of the salvage or rescue archaeology, much of it government-funded, has given a new impetus to the archaeology of our towns and cities to what in Europe is known as medieval or post-medieval archaeology, and what in the United States and elsewhere is called historical archaeology. Who are the searchers? The growth of salvage work also leads us to ask, who today actually are the searchers in archaeology? A century ago they were often wealthy individuals who had the leisure to speculate about the past and to undertake excavations. Or in other cases, they were travelers who had reason to be in remote places and used the opportunity to undertake researches in what was effectively their spare time. 40 years ago, the searchers in archaeology tended to be university scholars, or the representatives of museums seeking to enlarge their collections, or the employees of learned societies and academic institutions. Nearly all of them based in the more prosperous capitals of Europe and the United States. Today, most countries have their own government archaeological or historical services. The scope of current public archaeology is reviewed in chapters 14 and 15. But it is worth noting here that today a searcher is more likely to be an employee, often directly or indirectly a government employee, on a salvage project, than an independent research worker. Today's searchers are engaged in a wide range of different roles, as reflected in the contemporary professionals whose careers are presented in Chapter 16. New currents of thought. Fresh currents of thought in the 1980s and 1990s, drawn first from architectural theory and literary studies, and then from wider social and philosophical fields, encouraged a great diversity of approaches to the past. While many field archaeologists were relatively untouched by theoretical debates, and the processual tradition established by the new archaeology rolled on, there were several new approaches, sometimes collectively termed post-processual, which dealt with interesting and difficult questions. Influential arguments, some first advanced by Ian Hodder and his students, have stressed that there is no single, correct way to undertake archaeological inference, and that the goal of objectivity is unattainable. Even the archaeological data are theory-laden, and as many readings are possible as there are research workers. But in their more extreme form, these arguments have led to charges of relativism, or a research style where anything goes, and where the borders between archaeological research and fiction may be difficult to define. The earlier writings of Michael Shanks and Christopher Tilley, especially their somewhat provocative Black and Red books, initially provoked reactions of this kind. But in their later writings they, and indeed the majority of post-processual archaeologists, have taken a less aggressively anti-scientific tone, and the emphasis has instead been upon the use of a variety of personal and often humanistic insights to develop a range of different fields and interests. Recognizing the varied perspectives of different social groups, and accepting the consequent multivocality of the postmodern world. The epistemological debate seems over now, with much less rhetorical position-taking and the recognition that there is no single or coherent post-processual archaeology, but rather a whole series of interpretive approaches and interests, enriched by the variety of intellectual sources upon which various scholars have drawn. Michael Shanks and Ian Hodder suggested that interpretive archaeologies may be a more positive label than post-processual. These are old debates now, and in recent years there has been some convergence of views, with a tendency towards a more holistic approach where different perspectives can be brought together. One of the strengths of the interpretive approach is to bring into central focus the actions and thoughts of individuals in the past, which is also the goal of cognitive archaeology. But it goes beyond the methodological individualism of the latter, arguing that in order to understand and interpret the past, it is necessary to employ empathy, to get inside the minds and think the thoughts of ancient people. This might seem a logical goal when examining symbolic systems such as figurative works employing a complex iconography, but it presents problems when no iconographic data exist. The various interpretive archaeologies often reject the tendency toward cross-cultural comparison and the modes of explanation relying upon generalization characteristic of processual archaeology. So too do those working in classical archaeology or in other cases where the textual evidence is so rich as to require that the approach be context-specific. Postpercealism is a collective term for a number of approaches to the past, all of which have roots in the postmodernist current of thought that developed in the 1980s and 1990s. The neo-Marxist element has a strong commitment to social awareness, that it is the duty of the archaeologist not only to describe the past, but to use such insights to change the present world. This contrasts quite strikingly with the aspirations towards objectivity of many processual archaeologists. The post-positivist approach rejects the focus on the systematic procedures of scientific method central to processual archaeology, sometimes seeing modern science as hostile to the individual, forming an integral part of the systems of domination by which the forces of capitalism exert their hegemony. The phenomenological approach lays stress on the personal experiences of the individual and on the way in which encounters with the material world and the objects in it shape our understanding of the world. In landscape archaeology, for example, the archaeologist sets out to experience the humanly shaped landscape as it has been modified and formed by human activities. The praxis approach lays stress upon the central role of the human agent and upon the primary significance of human actions in shaping social structure. Many social norms and social structures are established and shaped by habitual experience. The role of the individual as a significant agent is thus emphasized. The hermeneutic view rejects generalization. Emphasis is laid, rather, upon the uniqueness of each society and culture and on the need to study the full context of each in all its diversity. A related view is that there can be no single correct interpretation. Each observer or analyst is entitled to their own opinion about the past. There will therefore be a wide range of perspectives, which is why the emphasis is on interpretive archaeologies. Interpretive or post-processual archaeologies. Some of the most interesting work on themes such as the rise of complex societies thus continues to be undertaken outside the new interpretive tradition by such scholars as Kent Flannery, Henry Wright, or Tim Earle, who are willing to make cross-cultural comparisons within a more general framework. The study of early human developments also has to operate within a comparative framework where hominin fossils and material culture are compared between continents. Questions relating to the development of human cognitive abilities are certainly being addressed with renewed vigor. In other areas, however, and notably for those periods when archaeology can be text-dated, interpretive approaches are widespread. The problem of comparing different societies remains a taxing one. Simply to label societies as state or chiefdom does not, as discussed above, in itself make the comparison more effective. One theme which has recently come to the fore is an increased appreciation of the role played by artifacts themselves, material things, in the development of human relationships and the promotion of social and technological change. Such a view goes beyond the early materialism of economic thinkers such as Karl Marx and looks in more detail at the symbolic roles played by artifacts in the articulation of human societies. It involves also a consideration of agency, whether in people or in things. The notion that specific objects have symbolic meaning and have active roles in social life makes it appropriate to speak of the agency of things. That is one of the innovations of actor network theory. Another special focus of growing interest is the human body and the way it has been viewed, conceptualized, and represented by different societies. Pluralizing pasts. The interpretive archaeologists are right in arguing that our own interpretation and presentation of the past, as in any museum display, or indeed in the origin myth of almost any modern nation, involves choices which depend less on an objective assessment of the data than on the feelings and opinions of the researchers and of the clients whom they aim to please. The Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., found it almost impossible to mount an exhibition in 1995 dealing with the destruction of Hiroshima 50 years earlier, without exciting the ire both of ex-servicemen and of liberals sensitive to Japanese sensibilities. The development of indigenous archaeologies raises comparable issues. These issues came to the fore in successive meetings of the World Archaeology Congress, founded in 1986 by the British archaeologist Peter Ucko, who had served as the principal of the Australian Institute of Aboriginal Studies, where he had quickly perceived the need to create and heed a platform for Indigenous voices. Bias of the discipline of archaeology. As Margaret Conkey pointed out, there existed a need to reclaim women's experience as valid, to theorize this experience, and to use this to build a program of political action. However, the questions they raised were not widely explored until the 1990s because it was not until then that a suitable critical climate existed in archaeology. In Britain, this was provided by the theoretical development of post-processual archaeology, and much feminist research has been conducted within this framework. In North America, a combination of feminist critique, the growth of historical archaeology, and the keen interest taken by indigenous groups in their own past, formed the intellectual environment for the debate. Comparable questions have continued to emerge in the developing indigenous archaeologies in the territories of former colonies, now emancipated from imperial rule. The appropriate policy for cultural heritage management, and indeed the very nature of the cultural heritage, are often contested among competing interest groups, sometimes along ethnic lines. Marginalized groups, such as the Australian Aborigines, have sought to gain more influence in the definition and management of the heritage, having often found their interests overlooked and misunderstood. Deeper questions arise, however, about the nature of the globalization process, itself the outcome of technological advances developed in the West, and whether the very notion of cultural heritage as commonly understood may be a product of Western thought. The Western-conceived notion of cultural heritage management has been seen by post-colonial thinkers as an imposition of Western values, with officially endorsed notions of heritage perhaps leading to homogenization and the undervaluation of cultural diversity. Even the UNESCO-sponsored listing of World Heritage Sites, from the standpoint of this critique, is dominated by Western-formulated ideas of heritage. Such questions are also raised much nearer to home by archaeologists in the Western world. There is an increasing interest in the archaeology of recent centuries, right down to the present, to the point that heritage becomes a term whose precise meanings are frequently contested. While some aspects of the archaeology at the beginning of the new millennium were inevitably controversial, they were also in some ways very positive. They emphasized the value of the past to the contemporary world, and led to the realization that cultural heritage is an important part of the human environment, and in some ways as fragile as the natural environment. This implies that the archaeologist has a crucial role to play in achieving a balanced view also of our present world, which is inescapably the product of the worlds which have preceded it. The task of interpretation is now recognized as much more complex than it once seemed. That is all part of the loss of innocence which accompanied the new archaeology 50 years ago. 1.48 The presentation of the past can be controversial and open to criticisms of lack of objectivity and insensitivity to different views of the past, as shown by an exhibition concerned with Hiroshima at the Smithsonian Institution in 1995. Although the 1994 meeting in New Delhi, India, was marred by internal Indian disagreements, and intending participants from Arab and developing countries were refused U.S. entry visas for the 2003 WAC in Washington, D.C., the Congress has succeeded in creating a forum where the archaeologies of newly emerged nations and of different ethnic groups are respected and encouraged. It is evident that archaeology cannot avoid being caught up in the issues of the day, social and political as well as intellectual. Indeed, some practitioners feel that this is its primary role, as Randall McGuire argues in Archaeology as Political Action. An example is the influence of feminist thinking and growth of feminist archaeology, which overlaps with the relatively new field of gender studies. A pioneer in the emphasis of the importance of women in prehistory was Maria Giambutas. Her research in the Balkans led her to create a vision of an old Europe associated with the first farmers whose central focus was a belief in a great mother goddess figure. Although many feminist archaeologists today would take issue with certain aspects of Giambutas' approach, she has certainly helped foster the current debate on gender roles. In an article published in 1984, Margaret Conkey and Janet Spector drew attention to the androcentrism, male. The history of research at this important early farming site in Turkey illustrates the changing approaches to archaeology in the past half-century. Original excavations. The site was discovered by archaeologist James Mellart in 1958 in the course of a survey of the fertile Konya Plain in south-central Turkey which began in 1951. He started excavating the site in 1961, and the dramatic nature of his discovery soon became clear. The 21 high mound cloaked the remains of an early Neolithic town 13 hectares in extent with an agglomerate plan and with deeply stratified levels going back at least to 7,200 BC. The well-preserved rooms had plastered walls, some with wall paintings and plaster decorations incorporating bull skulls, and the finds included terracotta figures, several of them female, suggesting to certain scholars a mother goddess cult. Beginning surface research in 1993 and excavation in 1995. One aim of the project was to use modern field techniques to investigate the structure of the site and the functioning of its buildings to answer some of the central questions left unresolved by Mellart. A falling water table in the area made urgent the investigation of the lower, unexcavated parts of the site which were known to have well-preserved organic remains, such as wood, baskets, and perhaps unfired clay tablets, necessitating a 6-month excavation season in 1999. But Hodder also set himself two yet more ambitious objectives appropriate to the interpretive approach arising from the post-processual debate. The first was to develop a more flexible and open approach to stratigraphic excavation. This has involved encouraging interpretation at the trowel's edge. The moment of excavation is surrounded in discussion between the excavator and a wide range of specialists. The different specialists process material from the trench quickly so that they can feed information back to the excavator. The excavators are also asked to keep video records and to make diary entries about their interpretations as they dig, and all the data are made available on an interactive database. Catalhoyuk, Interpretive Archaeologies in Action. 1.50 A large clay figurine of a mother goddess supported by two felines, found by Mellart. Preserved remains of textiles, plants, and animals were recovered, and the obsidian of which the abundant tools were made proved on trace element analysis to derive from local sources. In 1965 the excavation was interrupted, leaving many questions unanswered. In particular, it was not clear whether Mellart's excavations at the southwest part of the site had revealed a shrine quarter, or whether the high frequency of rooms with painted walls and other symbolic materials would be repeated on other parts of the mound. Aims of the new research is Ian Hodder, the most influential figure in the post-processual movement of the 1980s and 1990s, has taken up the challenge offered by the site. Catalhoyuk. The second objective was similarly to allow more open-ended and multivocal approaches to the interpretation of the site as a whole, allowing not only different specialists to have a voice, but also the local inhabitants, and indeed visitors. Not least those considering the site to be important for the emergence of a cult of the mother goddess. The decision to make data from the excavation available on the project's website thus goes beyond a simple intention to publish the findings promptly. It furthers the post-processual wish for multiple and alternative interpretations by all those choosing to take part. While the excavators have a duty to use their 1.52 The new excavations directed by Ian Hodder. 1.51 Recently discovered skeletal figurine. 1.53 A recent reconstruction based on the discoveries in Building 1. A team from Poznan in Poland, and 3 Turkish excavation teams. These teams, the Anthropological Project, and the Museum and Interpretive Public Programs all operate under the general direction of Ian Hodder. Results. The excavation, due to last 25 years, has been underway now for over 15 years, and it is possible to assess the extent to which the use of a reflexive methodology gives insights that differ from those of 40 years ago. Certainly a large number of publications have appeared, including a volume written by Sidretin Durrell, The Site Guard, New Insights from Detailed Micromorphological, Microresidue, and chemical studies of deposits on floors have shown that buildings such as Mellart's Shrine 6.10 were houses used for a wide range of daily functions. The complex symbolism at Catalhoyuk was an integral part of daily life. The figurines of women, along with men and animals, have depositional contexts in middens which do not suggest gods and goddesses. Hodder's approach has its critics, yet this appears to hold the promise of being an influential project where a different and coherent theoretical approach does have a significant impact on archaeological practice. Specialist knowledge of the site to put forward interpretations, an inclusive approach is sought. The accompanying anthropological project focuses on the community living in the surrounding villages, on domestic and foreign tourists visiting the site, on goddess groups and worshippers, on local and central government officials, and on artists and fashion designers interested in the site. This multi-sided ethnography is seen as an integral part of the reflexive methodology used at Catalhoyuk. In the same spirit, several semi-independent excavation teams work in different areas of the site, including a team of Berkeley archaeologists. The history of archaeology is both the history of ideas and ways of looking at the past, and the history of employing those ideas and investigating questions. Humans have always speculated about their past, but it was not until 1784 that Thomas Jefferson undertook the first scientific excavation in the history of archaeology. the discipline of archaeology became firmly established in the 19th century when three great advances, namely the acceptance of the antiquity of humankind, the concept of evolution, and the development of the three-age system, offered a framework for studying and asking intelligent questions about the past. The classificatory historical period of archaeology lasted from the mid-19th century until around 1960, and its chief concern was the development and study of chronologies. During this time there were rapid advances in scientific aids for archaeology, particularly in the field of dating. The 1960s marked a turning point in archaeology, and dissatisfaction with the classificatory historical approach led to the birth of the new archaeology. Also known as processual archaeology, its advocates sought to explain the past rather than simply describe it. To do this, new archaeologists largely turned away from historical approaches in favor of science. New thinking in the 1980s and 1990s, some of it postmodernist, led to the development of interpretive or postperceasual archaeology. Advocates believed that there is no single correct way to undertake archaeological inference and that objectivity in research is impossible. Interpretive archaeologies place emphasis on the varied perspectives of different social groups, arguing that not everyone experiences the past in the same way. In the post-colonial world, archaeology plays a significant role in the establishment of national and ethnic identity, and heritage tourism is a profitable business. Good introductions to the history of archaeology include Bonn, P.G. 1996, The Cambridge Illustrated History of Archaeology. Cambridge University Press, Cambridge and New York. Bonn, P.G. 2014, The History of Archaeology, An Introduction. Routledge, London. Broman, D.L. and Williams, S. 2002. New Perspectives on the Origins of Americanist Archaeology. University of Alabama Press, Tuscaloosa. Daniel, G., and Renfrew, circa 1988. The Idea of Prehistory. Edinburgh University Press, Edinburgh, Columbia University Press, New York. Fagan, B.M. 1996. Eyewitness to Discovery. Oxford University Press, Oxford and New York. Fagan, B.M. 2004. A Brief History of Archaeology, Classical Times to the 21st Century. Prentice Hall, Upper Saddle River, New Jersey. Freeman, M. 2004. Victorians and the Prehistoric, Tracks to a Lost World. Yale University Press, New Haven, Connecticut. Hodder, I. and Hudson, S. 2004. Reading the Past, Current Approaches to Interpretation in Archaeology. Cambridge University Press, Cambridge and New York. Johnson, M. 2010. Archaeological Theory, An Introduction. Blackwell, Oxford and Malden, Massachusetts. Lowenthal, D. 1999. The Past is a Foreign Country. Cambridge University Press, Cambridge and New York. Prussell, R.W. and Hodder, I. 1996. Contemporary Archaeology in Theory, a Reader. Blackwell, Oxford and Malden, Massachusetts. Renfrew, circa 2007. Prehistory, The Making of the Human Mind. Weidenfeld and Nicholson, London, Modern Library, New York. Renfrew, C., and Bonn, P. 2004. Key Concepts in Archaeology. Routledge, London and New York. Rowley Conway, P. 2007. From Genesis to Prehistory, the Archaeological Three-Age System and its Contested Reception in Denmark, Britain, and Ireland. Oxford University Press, Oxford. Schnapp, A. 1996. The Discovery of the Past. British Museum Press, London, Abrams, New York. Schnapp, A. and Christensen, K. 1999. Discovering the Past in Companion Encyclopedia of Archaeology, 3, 47 Routledge, London and New York. Trigger, BG 2006. A History of Archaeological Thought. Cambridge University Press, Cambridge and New York. Wiley, Gr. and Sabloff, J.A. 1993. A History of American Archaeology. W. H. Freeman, New York. Further reading. Summary. 2. The relics of past human activity are all around us. Some of them were deliberate constructions, built to last, like the pyramids of Egypt, the Great Wall of China, or the temples of Mesoamerica and India. Others, like the remains of the Maya irrigation systems of Mexico and Belize, are the visible relics of activities whose aim was not primarily to impress the observer, but which still command respect today for the scale of the enterprise they document. Most of the remains of archaeology are far more modest, however. They are the discarded refuse from the daily activities of human existence, the food remains, the bits of broken pottery, the fractured stone tools, the debris that everywhere is formed as people go about their daily lives. In this chapter we define the basic archaeological terms, briefly survey the scope of the surviving evidence and look at the great variety of ways in which it has been preserved for us. From the frozen soils of the Russian steppes, for instance, have come the wonderful finds of Pasaric, great chieftains' burials where wood and textiles and skins are splendidly preserved. From the dry caves of Peru and other arid environments have come remarkable textiles, baskets, and other remains that often perish completely. By contrast, from wetlands, whether the swamps of Florida or the lake villages of Switzerland, further organic remains are being recovered, this time preserved not by the absence of moisture, but by its abundant presence to the exclusion of air. Extremes of temperature and of humidity have preserved much. So too have natural disasters. The volcanic eruption that destroyed Pompeii and Herculaneum is the most famous of them, but there have been others, such as the eruption of the Ilopango volcano in El Salvador in the 2nd century AD, which buried settlements in a large part of the southern Maya area. Our knowledge of the early human past is dependent in this way on the human activities and natural processes that have formed the archaeological record, and on those further processes that determine, over long periods of time, what is left and what is gone forever. Today we can hope to recover much of what is left, and to learn from it by asking the right questions in the right way. One of the main concerns of the archaeologist is the study of artifacts, objects modified or made by people. But, as the work of Graham Clark and other pioneers of the ecological approach has demonstrated, there is a whole category of non-artifactual organic and environmental remains. Ecofacts that can be as revealing about many aspects of past human activity. Much archaeological research has to do with the analysis of artifacts and the organic and environmental remains that are found together on sites, themselves most productively studied together with their surrounding landscapes and grouped into regions. Artifacts are humanly made or modified portable objects, such as stone tools, pottery, and weapons. In Chapter 8, we look at methods for analyzing human technological prowess. In the mastery of materials for artifacts. But artifacts help us answer all the key questions, not just technological ones addressed in this book. A single clay vessel or pot can be the subject of several lines of inquiry. The clay may be tested to produce a date for the vessel and thus perhaps a date for the location where it was found, and tested to find the source of the clay, giving evidence for the range and contacts of the group that made the vessel. Pictorial decoration on the pot's surface may be used in a typological sequence and tell us something about ancient beliefs. An analysis of the vessel's shape and any residues found in it can yield information about the pot's use, perhaps in cooking, as well as about ancient diet. W hat is LUFT. The variety of the evidence. Basic categories of archaeological evidence. Some researchers broaden the meaning of the term artifact to include all humanly modified components of a site or landscape, such as hearths, post holes, and storage pits. But these are more usefully described as features, defined in essence as non-portable artifacts. Simple features such as post holes may themselves, or in combination with remains of hearths, floors, ditches, etc., give evidence for complex features or structures, defined as buildings of all kinds, from houses and granaries to palaces and temples. Non-artifactual organic and environmental remains or ecofacts include human skeletons, animal bones, and plant remains, but also soils and sediments, all of which shed light on past human activities. They are important because they can indicate what people ate or the environmental conditions under which they lived. Archaeological sites may be thought of as places where artifacts, features, structures, and organic and environmental remains are found together. For working purposes, one can simplify this still further and define sites as places where significant traces of human activity are identified. Thus, a village or town is a site, and so too is an isolated monument like Serpent Mound in Ohio or Stonehenge in England. Equally, a surface scatter of stone tools or potsherds may represent a site occupied for no more than a few hours, whereas a Near Eastern tell is a site indicating human occupation over perhaps thousands of years. In Chapter 5 we consider the great variety of sites in more detail and look at the ways in which archaeologists classify them and study them regionally, as part of the investigation of settlement patterns. Here, however, we are more concerned with the nature of individual sites and how they are formed. The importance of context. In order to reconstruct past human activity at a site, it is crucially important to understand the context of a find. Whether artifact, feature, structure, or organic remain. A find's context consists of its immediate matrix, its provenience, and its association with other finds, occurrence together with other archaeological remains. Usually in the same matrix. In the 19th century, the demonstration that stone tools were associated with the bones of extinct animals in sealed deposits or matrices helped establish the idea of humanity's high antiquity. Increasingly since then, archaeologists have recognized the importance of identifying and accurately recording associations between remains on sites. This is why it is such a tragedy when looters dig up sites indiscriminately looking for rich finds, without recording matrix, provenience, or associations. All the contextual information is lost. A looted vase may be an attractive object for a collector, but far more could have been learned about the society that produced it had archaeologists been able to record where it was found and in association with what other artifacts or organic remains, weapons, tools, or animal bones. Much information about the Mimbres people of the American Southwest has been lost forever because looters bulldozed their sites, hunting for the superbly painted and highly sought-after bulls made by the Mimbres 1,000 years ago. When modern looters disturb a site, perhaps shifting aside material they are not interested in, they destroy that material's primary context. If archaeologists subsequently excavate that shifted material, they need to be able to recognize that it is in a secondary context. This may be straightforward for, say, a Mimbres site, looted quite recently, but it is much more difficult for a site disturbed in antiquity. Nor is disturbance confined to human activity, archaeologists dealing with the tens of thousands of years. European region. 1. 40 million. Areas settled by first farmers. Northwest German region. 1. 4 million. Areas settled by first farmers. Rhine-Ahr. 2.1 Different scales and terminology used in archaeology, from the continental region to the individual structure. In this representation of the pattern of settlement of Europe's first farmers, the archaeologist might study, at the broader scale, the interesting association between sites and light, easily worked soils near rivers. At the smaller scale, the association established by excavation of houses with other houses and with structures such as silos for grain storage raises questions, for example, about social organization and permanence of occupation at this period. Individual site. Individual structure. 1. 400. 1. 4,000. Early phase house. Refuse pit containing organic remains. Scatter of artifacts. Artifacts and features are found in association with the structure. Post hole. Path. Silo. Later phase house. Small region. 1/400,000. Areas with soils suitable for first farmers. Sites. Rhine R. Group of sites in association with river. 1/40,000. Merzbach R. Of the Old Stone Age or Paleolithic period, know well that the forces of nature, encroaching seas or ice sheets, wind and water action invariably destroy primary context. 2.2-3 Early humans as mighty hunters or mere scavengers. Our understanding of formation processes governs the way in which we interpret associations of human tools with animal bones from the fossil record in Africa. In recent years, archaeologists have become increasingly aware that a whole series of formation processes may have affected both the way in which finds came to be buried and what happened to them after they were buried, or in other words, their taphonomy. One can make a useful distinction between cultural formation processes and natural formation processes. Cultural processes involve the deliberate or accidental activities of human beings as they make or use artifacts, build or abandon buildings, plow fields, and so on. Natural formation processes are natural events that govern the burial and survival of the archaeological record. The sudden fall of volcanic ash that covered Pompeii is an exceptional natural process. More common is the gradual burial of artifacts or features by windborne sand or soil. The transporting of stone tools by river action is another natural process, as is the activity of animals on a site burrowing into it or chewing bones and pieces of wood. At first sight, these distinctions may seem of little interest to the archaeologist. In fact, they are vital to the accurate reconstruction of past human activities. It may be important, for instance, to know whether certain archaeological evidence is the product of human or non-human activity. If you are trying to reconstruct human woodworking activities by studying cut marks on timber, then you should learn to recognize certain kinds of marks made by beavers using their teeth and to distinguish these from cut marks made by humans using stone or metal tools. Let us take an even more significant example. For the earliest phases of human existence in Africa, a great many of the Stone Age tools found in European river gravels are in a secondary context, transported by water action far from their original, primary context. Formation processes. Beginning of the Old Stone Age or Paleolithic period, great theoretical schemes about our primitive hunting ability have been based on the association between stone tools and animal bones found at archaeological sites. The bones were assumed to be those of animals hunted and slaughtered by the early humans who made the tools. But studies of animal behavior and cut marks on animal bones by C.K. Brain, Louis Binford, and others suggest that in many cases the excavated bones are the remains of animals hunted by other predator animals and largely eaten by these. The humans with their stone tools would have come upon the scene as mere scavengers, at the end of a pecking order of different animal species. By no means everyone agrees with this scavenging hypothesis. The point to emphasize. Experimental archaeology. One effective way to study formation processes is through long-term experimental archaeology. An excellent example is the experimental earthwork constructed on Overton Down, southern England, in 1960. The earthwork consists of a substantial chalk and turf bank, 21 m long, 7 m wide, and 2 m high, with a ditch cut parallel to it. The aim of the experiment has been to assess not only how the bank and ditch alter through time, but also what happens to materials such as pottery, leather, and textiles that were buried in the earthwork in 1960. Sections have been or will be cut across the bank and ditch at intervals of 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, and 128 years, a considerable commitment for all concerned. On this timescale, the project is nearly halfway complete. The results yielded so far are interesting. In the 1960s, the bank dropped some 25 centimeters in height and the ditch silted up quite rapidly. Since the mid-1970s, however, the structure has stabilized. As for the buried materials, tests after 4 years showed that pottery was unchanged and leather little affected. But textiles were already becoming weakened and discolored. The 1992 excavations revealed that preservation was better in the chalk bank, which is less biologically active, than in the turf core where textiles and some wood had completely disappeared. The structure itself had changed little since 1976, though there was considerable reworking and transport of fine sediment by earthworms. The experiment has already shown that many of the changes that interest archaeologists occur within decades of burial, and that the extent of these changes can be far greater than had hitherto been suspected. Here is that the issue can best be resolved by improving our techniques for distinguishing between cultural and natural formation processes, between human and non-human activity. Many studies are now focusing on the need to clarify how one differentiates cut marks on bones made by stone tools from those made by the teeth of animal predators. Modern experiments using replica stone tools to cut meat off bones are one helpful approach. Other kinds of experimental archaeology can be most instructive about some of the formation processes that affect physical preservation of archaeological material. The remainder of this chapter is devoted to a more detailed discussion of the different cultural and natural formation processes. 2.4 The bank and ditch as cut in 1960, together with the changes revealed by sections cut across the earthwork in 1962 and 1976. 1960, 1962, 1976. One may separate these processes rather crudely into two kinds, those that reflect the original human behavior and activity before a find or site became buried, and those that came after burial. Now, of course, most major archaeological sites are formed as the result of a complex sequence of use, burial, and reuse repeated many times over, so that a simple twofold division of cultural formation processes may not be so simple to apply in practice. Nevertheless, since one of our main aims is to reconstruct original human behavior and activity, we must make the attempt. Original human behavior is commonly reflected archaeologically in at least 4 major activities. In the case of a tool, for example, there may be 1. Acquisition of the raw material, 2. Manufacture, 3. Use, and finally, 4. Disposal or discard when the tool is worn out or broken. Similarly, a food crop such as wheat will be acquired, manufactured, used, and discarded. Here one might add a common intermediate stage of storage before use. From the archaeologist's point of view, the critical factor is that remains can enter the archaeological record at any one of these stages. A tool may be lost or thrown out as inferior quality during manufacture, a crop may be accidentally burnt and thus preserved during processing. In order accurately to reconstruct the original activity, it is therefore crucial to try to understand which of the stages one is looking at. It may be quite easy to identify, say, the first stage for stone tools, because stone quarries can often be recognized by deep holes in the ground with piles of associated waste flakes and blanks which survive well. But it is much more difficult to know beyond reasonable doubt whether a sample of charred plant remains comes from, say, a threshing floor or an occupation floor. And this may also make it difficult to reconstruct the true plant diet, since certain activities may favor the preservation of certain species of plant. This whole controversial issue is discussed further in Chapter 7. Bifacial point in haft. Broken bifacial point. Use. Hammerstone. Finished bifacial point. Waste. Waste. Acquisition. 2.5 An artifact may have entered the archaeological record at any one of these 4 stages in its life cycle. The archaeologist's task is to determine which stage is represented by the find in question. Cultural formation processes: how people have affected what survives in the archaeological record. Deliberate burial of valuables or the dead is a major aspect of original human behavior that has left its mark on the archaeological record. In times of conflict or war, people often deposit prized possessions in the ground, intending to reclaim them at a later date but sometimes failing to do so. These hoards are a prime source of evidence for certain periods, such as the European Bronze Age, for which hoards of metal goods are common, or later Roman Britain, which has yielded buried treasures of silver and other precious metals. One difficulty, however, is in distinguishing between hoards originally intended to be reclaimed and valuables buried perhaps to placate supernatural powers, with no reclamation intended. How archaeologists set about trying to demonstrate belief in supernatural powers and an afterlife is the subject of Chapter 10. Here we may note that, in addition to hoards, the major source of evidence comes from burial of the dead, whether in modest graves, elaborate burial mounds, or giant pyramids, usually with grave goods such as ceramic vessels or weapons, and sometimes with painted tomb chamber walls, as in ancient Mexico or Egypt. The Egyptians indeed went so far as to mummify their dead to preserve them, they hoped, for eternity, as did the Incas of Peru, whose kings were kept in the Temple of the Sun at Cusco and brought outside for special ceremonies. Human destruction of the archaeological record might be caused by burials of the kind just described being dug into earlier deposits. But people in the past deliberately or accidentally obliterated traces of their predecessors in innumerable other ways. Rulers, for instance, often destroyed monuments or erased inscriptions belonging to previous chiefs or monarchs. A classic example of this occurred in ancient Egypt, where the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, who tried to introduce a new religion in the 14th century BC, was reviled by his successors and his major buildings were torn down for reuse in other monuments. A Canadian team led by Donald Redford has spent many years recording some of these reused stone blocks at Thebes and has successfully matched them with the help of a computerized database in order to reconstruct, like a giant jigsaw, part of one of Akhenaten's temples. Some human destruction meant to obliterate has inadvertently preserved material for the archaeologist to find. Burning, for example, may not always destroy. It can often improve the chances of survival of a variety of remains such as of plants. The conversion into carbon greatly increases the powers of resistance to the ravages of time. Clay daubing and adobe usually decay, but if a structure has been fired, the mud is baked to the consistency of a brick. In the same way, thousands of clay writing tablets from the Near East have been baked accidentally or deliberately in fires and thus preserved. Timbers too may char and survive in structures, or at least leave a clear impression in the hardened mud. Today, human destruction of the archaeological record continues at a frightening pace, through land drainage, plowing, building work, looting, etc. In Chapter 14 we discuss how this affects archaeology generally and what the potential implications are for the future. We saw above how natural formation processes can disturb or destroy the primary context of archaeological material. Here we will focus on that material itself and the natural processes that cause decay or enable preservation. Practically any archaeological material, from plant remains to metals, can survive in exceptional circumstances. Under normal conditions, however, inorganic materials survive far better than organic ones. Inorganic materials. The most common inorganic materials to survive archaeologically are stone, clay, and metals. Stone tools survive extraordinarily well, some are over 2 million years old. Not surprisingly, they have always been our main source of evidence for human activities during the Paleolithic period, even though wooden and bone tools may originally have equaled stone ones in importance. Stone tools sometimes come down to us so little damaged or altered from their primary state that archaeologists can examine microscopic patterns of wear on their cutting edges and learn, for example, whether the tools were used to cut wood or animal hides. This is now a major branch of archaeological inquiry. Fired clay, such as pottery and baked mud brick or adobe, is virtually indestructible if well fired. It is therefore again not surprising that for the periods after the introduction of pottery, making ceramics have traditionally been the archaeologist's main source of evidence. As we saw earlier in this natural formation processes, how nature affects what survives in the archaeological record chapter, pots can be studied for their shape, surface decoration, mineral content, and even the food or other residues left inside them. Acid soils can damage the surface of fired clay, and porous or badly fired clay vessels or mud brick can become fragile in humid conditions. However, even disintegrated mud brick can help to assess rebuilding phases in, for instance, Peruvian villages or Near Eastern tells. Metals such as gold, silver, and lead survive well. Copper and bronze with a low-quality alloy are attacked by acid soils and can become so oxidized that only a green deposit or stain is left. Oxidation is also a rapid and powerful agent of destruction of iron, which rusts and may likewise leave only a discoloration in the soil. However, as will be seen in Chapter 8, it is sometimes possible to retrieve vanished iron objects by making a cast of the hollow they have left within the soil or within a mass of corrosion. The sea is potentially very destructive, with underwater remains being broken and scattered by currents, waves, or tidal action. It can on the other hand cause metals to be coated with a thick, hard casing of metallic salts from the objects themselves. This helps to preserve the artifacts within. If the remains are simply taken out of the water and not treated, the salts react with air and give off acid which destroys the remaining metal. But the use of electrolysis, placing the object in a chemical solution and passing a weak current between it and a surrounding metal grill, leaves the metal artifact clean and safe. This is a standard procedure in underwater archaeology and is used on all types of objects from cannons to the finds recovered from the Titanic. Organic materials. Survival of organic materials is determined largely by the matrix and by climate, with the occasional influence of natural disasters such as volcanic eruptions, which are often far from disastrous for archaeologists. The matrix, as we saw earlier, is usually some kind of sediment or soil. These vary in their effects on organic material. Chalk, for example, preserves human and animal bone well. Acid soils destroy bones and wood within a few years, but will leave telltale discolorations where post holes or hut foundations once stood. Similar brown or black marks survive in sandy soils, as do dark silhouettes that used to be skeletons. But the immediate matrix may in exceptional circumstances have an additional component such as metal ore, salt, or oil. Copper can favor the preservation of organic remains, perhaps by preventing the activity of destructive microorganisms. The prehistoric copper mines of Central and Southeast Europe have many remains of wood, leather, and textiles. Organic packing material found between copper ingots on the 14th century BC Lubran shipwreck, off the coast of southern Turkey, also survived for the same reason. 2.6 The major sites and regions discussed in this chapter where natural formation processes from wet to very dry or cold conditions have led to exceptionally good preservation of archaeological remains. Chile dry, cold. Florida wetlands. Chinchorro dry. Andes cold. Peru dry. Danger Cave Lovelock Cave dry. Ozette wet. Aleutian Caves warm, dry. Beresovka cold Pasaric cold Egypt dry Pompeii. Natural disaster. Iceman cold Northern Europe wetlands. (2.7) This bronze head from a statue of a Greek male athlete was found off the coast of Croatia in 2001. Bronze survives well in seawater, but some 2,000 years of concretions had to be painstakingly removed by restorers. 2.8.9 Mud brick survives well in the dry conditions of the Near East. Here, at Tel Brak, Syria, excavations have exposed the remains of walls dating back more than 3,000 years. The modern building in the background is also constructed with mud bricks. Salt mines such as those of Iron Age Hallstatt, Austria, have helped preserve organic finds. Even more remarkably, a combination of salt and oil ensured the preservation of a woolly rhinoceros at Storunia, Poland, with skin intact, and the leaves and fruits of tundra vegetation around it. The animal had been carried by a strong current into a pool saturated with crude oil and salt from a natural oil seep, which prevented decomposition. Bacteria could not operate in these conditions, while salt had permeated the skin and preserved it. Similarly, the asphalt pits of La Brea, Los Angeles, are world famous for the prodigious quantities and fine condition of the skeletons of a wide range of prehistoric animals and birds recovered from them. Climate plays an important role too in the preservation of organic remains. Occasionally one can speak of the local climate of an environment such as a cave. Caves are natural conservatories because their interiors are protected from outside climatic effects, and their alkaline conditions permit excellent preservation. If undisturbed by floods or the trampling feet of animals and people, they can preserve bones and such fragile remains as footprints, and sometimes even fibers, such as the short length of rope found in the Upper Paleolithic decorated cave of Lascaux, France. More usually, however, it is the regional climate that is important. Tropical climates are the most destructive, with their combination of heavy rains, acid soils, warm temperatures, high humidity, erosion, and wealth of vegetation and insect life. Tropical rainforest flora can overwhelm a site remarkably quickly, with roots that dislodge masonry and tear buildings apart, while torrential downpours gradually destroy paint and plasterwork, and woodwork rots away completely. Archaeologists in southern Mexico, for example, constantly have to battle to keep back the jungle. On the other hand, one can also look on jungle conditions as benign, in that they hinder looters from easily reaching even more sites than they do already. Temperate climates, as in much of Europe and North America, are also not beneficial, as a rule, to organic materials. Their relatively warm but variable temperatures and fluctuating precipitation combine to accelerate the processes of decay. In some circumstances, however, local conditions can counteract these processes. At the Roman fort of Vindolanda, near Hadrian's Wall in northern England, over 1,300 letters and documents, written in ink on wafer-thin sheets of birch and alderwood, have been found. The fragments, dating to about AD 100, have survived because of the soil's unusual chemical condition. Clay, compacted between layers in the site, created oxygen-free pockets, while chemicals produced by bracken, bone, and other remains effectively made the land sterile in that locality, thus preventing disturbance by vegetation and other forms of life. A different example of freak preservation in temperate conditions occurred at Pottern, a late Bronze Age refuse heap in southern England dating to about 1000 BC, whereas bones normally become mineralized through the percolation of groundwater. In this site, bones as well as unburnt seeds and pottery have been preserved because a mineral called glauconite has translocated from the greensand bedrock and entered into a stable compound with the organic materials. Natural disasters sometimes preserve sites, including organic remains, for the archaeologist. The most common are violent storms, such as that which covered the coastal Neolithic village of Skara Orkney Islands, with sand, the mudslide that engulfed the prehistoric village of Ozette on America's northwest coast, or volcanic eruptions such as that of Vesuvius, which buried and preserved Roman Pompeii under a blanket of ash. Another volcanic eruption, this time in El Salvador in about AD 595, deposited a thick and widespread layer of ash over a densely populated area of Maya settlement. Work here by Payson Sheets and his associates has uncovered a variety of organic remains at the site of Seren, including palm and grass roofing, mats, baskets, stored grain, and even preserved agricultural furrows. As will be seen in Chapter 6, volcanic ash has also preserved part of a prehistoric forest at Miesenheim in Germany. Apart from these special circumstances, the survival of organic materials is limited to cases involving extremes of moisture, that is, waterlogged, arid, or frozen conditions. Preservation of organic materials, extreme conditions. Waterlogged environments. A useful distinction in land archaeology can be drawn between dryland and wetland sites. The great majority of sites are dry in the sense that moisture content is low and preservation of organic remains is poor. Wetland sites include all those found in lakes, swamps, marshes, fens, and peat bogs. In these situations, organic materials are effectively sealed in a wet and airless environment which favors their preservation, as long as the waterlogging is more or less permanent up to the time of excavation. One of the pioneers of wetland archaeology in Britain, John Coles, estimates that on a wet site often 75, 90%, sometimes 100% of the finds are organic. Little or none of this material, such as wood, leather, textiles, basketry, and plant remains of all kinds, would survive on most dryland sites. It is for this reason that archaeologists are turning their attention more and more to the rich sources of evidence about past human activities to be found on wet sites. Growing threats from drainage and peat cutting in the wetlands, which form only about 6% of the world's total land area, give this work an added urgency. Wetlands vary a great deal in their preservative qualities. Acidic peat bogs are kind to wood and plant remains, but may destroy bone, iron, and even pottery. The famous lake sites of the alpine regions of Switzerland, Italy, France, and southern Germany, on the other hand, preserve most materials well. Peat bogs, nearly all of which occur in northern latitudes, are some of the most important environments for wetland archaeology. The Somerset levels in southern England, for example, have been the scene not only of excavations early in the 20th century to recover the well-preserved Iron Age lake villages of Glastonbury and Mere, but of a much wider campaign in the last 4 decades that has unearthed numerous wooden trackways stretch of track, see box, pp. 336, 37, and many details about early woodworking skills and the ancient environment. On the continent of Europe and in Ireland, peat bogs have likewise preserved many trackways, sometimes with evidence for the wooden carts that ran along them and other fragile remains. Other types of European wetlands, such as coastal marshes, have yielded dugout logboats, paddles, even fish nets and fish weirs. Bog bodies, however, are undoubtedly the best-known finds from the peat bogs of northwest Europe. Most of them date from the Iron Age. The degree of preservation varies widely and depends on the particular conditions in which the corpses were deposited. Most individuals met a violent death and were probably either executed as criminals or killed as a sacrifice before being thrown into the bog. For example, in 2003, 2 partial Iron Age bodies were recovered from peat bogs in Ireland. Clonachaven man had been killed with axe blows and possibly disemboweled, while the huge tall, old Croghan man was stabbed, decapitated, mutilated, and tied to the bottom of a bog pool. See Ills. 2.18, 19. The best preserved specimens, such as Denmark's Grobel man, were in a truly remarkable state, with only the staining caused by bog water and tannic acid as an indication that they were ancient rather than modern. Within the skin, the bones have often disappeared, as have 2.10 General view from the north of the Ozette site. 2.11 An owl head on a shaman's club. A special kind of waterlogging occurred at the Ozette site, Washington, on the U.S. northwest coast. In about AD 1700, a huge mudslide buried part of a Maka Indian whale hunting village. Ruins of huge cedar plank houses lay protected by the mud for 3 centuries, but not forgotten, for the descendants kept the memory of their ancestors' home alive. Then the sea began to strip away the mud, and it seemed that the site might fall prey to looters. The Maka tribal chairman asked Washington State University archaeologist Richard Doherty to excavate the site and salvage its remains. Clearing the mud with water pumped from the ocean and sprayed through hoses brought a wealth of wood and fiber objects into view. The houses, where several related families would have lived, were up to 21 m in length and 14 m wide. They had adzed and carved panels, with designs including wolves and thunderbirds, roof support posts, and low partition walls. There were also hearths, sleeping platforms, storage boxes, mats, and baskets. Over 55,000 artifacts, mostly wooden, were recovered. They had been preserved by the wet mud, which excluded oxygen. The most spectacular was a block of red cedar, a meter high, carved in the form of a whale's dorsal fin. Even leaves still green survived, together with an abundance of whale bones. Field excavation and laboratory preservation continued non-stop for 11 years, an outstanding example of cooperation between archaeologists and indigenous people. Maka elders helped to identify artifacts, young Maka helped to excavate, and a museum now displays the results. 2.12 A Maka Indian crew member measures a piece of wood in one of the houses. Wet preservation, the Ozette site. United States. 2.13 Cleaning a basket holding a comb and a spindle whorl. 2.14 17 A selection of artifacts from Ozette, a wooden carving tool with a beaver tooth blade, a red cedar carving in the shape of a whale's dorsal fin, inlaid with 700 sea otter teeth. Some forming the shape of a thunderbird holding a serpent, which would stun the whale so that the thunderbird could pick it up in its claws, a whale harpoon blade of mussel shell, still in its protective cedar bark pouch, a bowl for seal or whale oil, carved in human form replete with hair. Woven material 1,330 baskets 1,466 mats 142 hats 37 cradles 96 tumblines 49 harpoon sheets. Weaving equipment 14 loom uprights 14 roller bars 10 swords 23 spindle whorls 6 spools. Hunting equipment 115 wooden bows and fragments 1534 arrow shafts 5189, wooden arrow points 124 harpoon shafts. 22 harpoon finger rests 161 plugs from sealskin floats. Fishing equipment 131 bentwood halibut hooks 607 curved halibut hook shanks 117 blanks for making hooks 7 herring rigs 57 single-barbed hooks 15 double-barbed hooks. Containers 1001 wooden boxes and fragments 120 wooden bowls and fragments 37 wooden trays watercraft 361 canoe paddles and fragments 14 canoe bailers 14 canoe fragments. Miscellaneous 40 game paddles. 45 carved miniature items. 52 carved wooden clubs. 1 carved effigy of a whale fin inlaid with sea otter teeth. Perishable artifacts from Ozette. Most of the internal organs, although the stomach and its contents may survive. In Florida, prehistoric human brains have even been recovered. Occasionally, waterlogged conditions can occur inside burial mounds, a temperate climate version of the Siberian phenomenon. The oak coffin burials of Bronze Age Northern Europe, and most notably those of Denmark dating to about 1000 BC, had an inner core of stones packed round the tree trunk coffin, with a round barrow built above. Water infiltrated the inside of the mound and by combining with tannin exuding from the tree trunks, set up acidic conditions that destroyed the skeleton but preserved the skin, hair, and ligaments of the bodies inside the coffins, as well as their clothing and objects such as birch bark pails. A somewhat similar phenomenon occurred with the ships that the Vikings used as coffins. The Oseberg ship in Norway, for example, held the body of a Viking queen of about at 800, and was buried in clay, covered by a packing of stones and a layer of peat that sealed it in and ensured its preservation. Lake dwellings have rivaled bog bodies in popular interest ever since the discovery of wooden piles or house supports in Swiss lakes well over a century ago. The romantic notion of whole villages built on stilts over the water has, thanks to detailed research since the 1940s, given way to the idea of predominantly lake-edge settlements. The range of preserved material is astonishing, including not simply wooden structures, artifacts, and textiles but, at Neolithic charavines in France for example, even nuts, berries, and other fruits. Perhaps the greatest contribution to archaeology that lake dwellings and other European wetland sites have made in recent years, however, is to provide abundant well-preserved timber for the study of tree rings, the annual growth rings in trees, for dating purposes. In Chapter 4 we explore the breakthrough this has brought about in the establishment of an accurate triering chronology for parts of northern Europe stretching back thousands of years. Another rich source of waterlogged and preserved timbers in land archaeology can be found in the old waterfronts of towns and cities. Archaeologists have been particularly successful in uncovering parts of London's Roman and medieval waterfront, but such discoveries are not restricted to Europe. In the early 1980s, archaeologists in New York City excavated a well-preserved 18th-century ship that had been sunk to support the East River waterfront there. Underwater archaeology itself, in rivers and lakes and especially beneath the sea, is not surprisingly. 2.18-19 The surviving parts of old Krogan man's body are superbly preserved, particularly his hands. The well-kept fingernails and absence of calluses suggest that he may have been an individual of relatively high status. Analysis of his stomach contents revealed a final meal of cereals and buttermilk. The richest source of all for waterlogged finds. Coastal erosion can also reveal once submerged structures, such as Seahenge, the prehistoric timber circle discovered on the eastern coast of England. The major problem with waterlogged finds, and particularly wood, is that they deteriorate rapidly when they are uncovered, beginning to dry and crack almost at once. They therefore need to be kept wet until they can be treated or freeze-dried at a laboratory. Conservation measures of this kind help to explain the cost of both wetland and underwater archaeology. It has been estimated that wet archaeology costs 4 times as much as dry archaeology. But the rewards, as we have seen above, are enormous. The rewards in the future, too, will be very great. Florida, for example, has about 1.2 million hectares of peat deposits, and on present evidence these probably contain more organic artifacts than anywhere else in the world. So far the wetlands here have yielded the largest number of prehistoric watercraft from any one region, together with totems, masks, and figurines dating as far back as 5000 BC in the Okeechobee Basin. For instance, a first millennium BC burial platform has been found, decorated with a series of large carved wooden totem posts representing an array of animals and birds. After a fire, the platform had collapsed into its pond. Yet it is only recently that wet finds in Florida have come to us from careful excavation rather than through the drainage that is destroying large areas of peat deposits and, with them, untold quantities of the richest kinds of archaeological evidence. Dry environments. Great aridity or dryness prevents decay through the shortage of water, which ensures that many destructive microorganisms are unable to flourish. Archaeologists first became aware of the phenomenon in Egypt, where much of the Nile Valley has such a dry atmosphere that bodies of the pre-dynastic period have survived intact, with skin, hair, and nails. Without any artificial mummified cation or coffins, the corpses were simply placed in shallow graves in the sand. Rapid drying out or desiccation, plus the draining qualities of the sand, produced such spectacular preservative effects that they probably suggested the practice of mummification to the later Egyptians of the dynastic period. 2.20 In 1998, erosion exposed this monument, known as Seahenge, in levels dating to the Bronze Age at Holme next the sea on England's Norfolk coast. An inverted oak tree, pushed into the ground with roots upwards, is surrounded by an oval ring of 54, close-set timber posts, mostly split oaks. Preserved by burial under sand and brine, it is thought to be a ritual structure, perhaps an altar for exposing corpses which would then be taken away by the sea. It has been triering dated to circa 2050-2049 BC. The arid conditions that prevail in Egypt have helped preserve a wide range of ancient materials, ranging from numerous written documents on papyrus to 2 full-size wooden boats buried beside the Great Pyramid at Giza. But the best-known and most spectacular array of objects was that discovered in 1922 by Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon in the tomb at Thebes of the pharaoh Tutankhamun, dating to the 14th century BC. Tutankhamun had a short reign and was relatively insignificant in Egyptian history, a fact reflected in his burial, a poor one by pharaonic standards. But within the small tomb, originally built for someone else, was a wealth. 2.21 The outermost of Tutankhamun's 3 coffins was made of cypress wood, overlaid with gold foil. 2.22 Tutankhamun's sarcophagus lay within 4 nesting shrines. Within the sarcophagus lay 3 further coffins, the final one preserving the king's mummy. Dry preservation. The tomb of Tutankhamun. Thebes, Egypt. 2.23 A cutaway view of the tomb and its treasures, as found in 1922. The entrance room was not fully cleared of its hundreds of grave goods until February 1923. It was only then that Carter and his team could explore the tomb's further chambers. Of treasure. For Tutankhamun was buried with everything he might need in the next life. The entrance corridor and the 4 chambers were crammed with thousands of individual grave goods. They include objects of precious metal, such as the jewelry and famous gold mask, and food and clothing. But wooden objects, including statues, chests, shrines, and 2 of the 3 coffins, make up a large part of the tomb's contents. The human remains, the mummies of the king and his 2 stillborn children, have been the subject of repeated scientific analysis. A lock of hair found separately among the grave goods. 2.24 A gilded ritual couch found remarkably well preserved among the contents of the tomb of Tutankhamun. Has been analyzed and is thought to come from a mummy in another tomb believed to be Tai, the young king's grandmother. The grave furniture was not all originally intended for Tutankhamun. Some of it had been made for other members of his family, and then hastily adopted when the young king died unexpectedly. There were also touching items, such as a chair the king had used as a child, and a simple reed stick mounted in gold labeled as a reed which His Majesty cut with his own hand. Even wreaths and funerary bouquets had survived in the dry conditions left on the 2nd and 3rd coffins by mourners. Archery equipment, baskets, beds, beer boat models, boomerangs and throw sticks, botanical specimens, boxes and chests, canopic equipment. Chairs and stools, chariot equipment. Clothing, coffins, cosmetic objects. Cuirass, divine figures, fans, foodstuffs, gaming equipment, gold mask. Granary model hassocks. Jewelry, beads, amulets, lamps and torches, mummies, musical instruments, portable pavilion, regalia, ritual couches, ritual objects. Royal figures, sarcophagi, shabti figures and related objects, shields, shrines and related objects, sticks and staves, swords and daggers, tools, vessels, wine jars. Writing equipment. Finds from the tomb. The Pueblo dwellers of the American Southwest buried their dead in dry caves and rock shelters where natural desiccation took place. These are not therefore true, humanly created mummies, although they are often referred to as such. The bodies survive, sometimes wrapped in fur blankets or tanned skins, in such good condition that it has been possible to study hairstyles. Clothing also remains, together with a wide range of goods such as basketry, feathered ornaments, and leather. Some far earlier sites in the same region also contain organic remains. Danger Cave, Utah, yielded trap springs, knife handles, and other wooden tools. Lovelock Cave, Nevada, had nets, while caves near Durango, Colorado, had preserved maize cobs, squashes, and sunflower and mustard seeds. Finds of this type have been crucial in helping to reconstruct ancient diet. The coastal dwellers of central and southern Peru lived and died in a similarly dry environment, so it is possible today to see the tattoos on their desiccated bodies and admire the huge and dazzlingly colorful textiles from cemeteries at Ica and Nazca, as well as basketry, featherwork, maize cobs and other food items. In Chile, the oldest deliberately made mummies have been found at Chinchorro, preserved again by the aridity of the desert environment. A slightly different phenomenon occurred in the Aleutian Islands, off the west coast of Alaska, where the dead were kept and naturally preserved in extremely dry, volcanically warmed caves. The islanders seem to have enhanced the natural desiccation by periodically drying the bodies by wiping or suspension over a fire. In some cases they removed the internal organs and placed dry grass in the cavity. 2.25, 26 frozen conditions in southern Siberia helped to preserve the remarkable finds from burial mounds of steppe nomads at Pasaric dating from about 400 BC. Tattoo patterns on the torso and arms of a chieftain from Pasaric. Cold environments. Natural refrigeration can hold the processes of decay in check for thousands of years. Perhaps the first frozen finds to be discovered were the numerous remains of mammoths encountered in the permafrost of Siberia, a few with their flesh, hair, and stomach contents intact. The unlucky creatures probably fell into crevices in snow, and were buried by silt in what became a giant deep freeze. The best known are Borisovka, recovered in 1901, and Baby Dima, found in 1977. Preservation can still be so good that dogs find the meat quite palatable and they have to be kept well away from the carcasses. Among the most famous frozen archaeological remains are those from the burial mounds of steppe nomads at Pasaric in the Altai, southern Siberia, dating to the Iron Age, about 400 BC. They consist of pits dug deep into the ground, lined with logs, and covered with a low cairn of stones. They could only have been dug in the warm season, before the ground froze solid. Any warm air in the graves rose and deposited its moisture on the stones of the cairn. Moisture also gradually infiltrated down into the burial chambers, and froze so hard there during the harsh winter that it never thawed during subsequent summers. Since the cairns were poor conductors of heat and shielded the pits from the warming and drying effects of wind and sun, consequently, even the most fragile materials have survived intact despite the boiling water that had to be used by the Soviet excavator, Sergei Rudenko, to recover them. The Pasaric bodies had been placed inside log coffins, with wooden pillows, and survived so well that their spectacular tattoos can still be seen. Clothing included linen shirts, decorated kaftans, aprons, stockings, and 2.27, 28 The younger Yuyayaka girl was found wearing a silver plaque. The older, better preserved girl had neatly braided hair and wore a selection of ornaments. Cold preservation 1. Mountain mummies. Since the 1950s, sporadic discoveries have been made of frozen bodies high in the Andes Mountains of South America. These finds have become known as mummies, even though they were preserved only by the cold, not by any process of artificial mummification. The Incas of the 15th, 16th centuries had built more than 100 ceremonial centers on many of the highest peaks in their empire, since they worshipped the snow-capped mountains, believing that they provided the water for irrigating their fields, and hence controlled fertility of crops and animals. Among the offerings left for the mountain gods were food, alcoholic drinks, textiles, pottery, and figurines, but also human sacrifices, often young children. In the 1990s, American archaeologist Johann Reinhard carried out a series of expeditions to high peaks in the Andes and discovered some of the best preserved ancient bodies ever found, thanks to this extreme archaeology. On the Giambutas volcano, at 6,312 m, he found a bundle lying on the ice that contained an Inca girl dubbed the Ice Maiden or Juanita, who had been ritually sacrificed at the age of about 14 and buried with figurines, food, textiles, and pottery. The buried bodies of a boy and girl were later excavated at 5,850 m. In 1999, on the peak of Yuyayaka at 6,739 m, he encountered a 7-year-old boy and 2 girls of 15 and 6, all with figurines and textiles. So perfect is the preservation of all these bodies that detailed analyses can be carried out on their internal organs, their DNA, and their hair. For example, isotopes in the hair suggest that they chewed coca leaves, a common practice in the region even today. Ampato. Yuyayaka Chile Bolivia Peru. Cold preservation 2, Snow patch archaeology. Snow patches are perennial accumulations of snow and ice found in the mountains of Norway and other parts of the world at high altitude or latitude, such as Alaska, the Rockies, and the Alps. Organic objects that have been lost or discarded by human visitors are often well preserved in these conditions, and may be discovered at the edges of patches when these melt sufficiently. In 2010 and 2011, fragments of 5 Neolithic arrows and a Neolithic bow were found at 2 mountain sites near Oppdal in central Norway, the oldest snow patch artifacts known from Scandinavia. Some of the arrow shafts were found with their small slate points and, in one case, the adhesive joining them survived. Another still had 2 rings of sinew thread attached. Similarly, a very well-preserved Iron Age tunic was found in Norway in 2011. It has been radiocarbon dated to add 230-390 made of fine lamb's wool. It has no buttons or fastenings, and would have been drawn over the head like a sweater. It would fit a slender man, c. 1.7 m in height. Mostly intact, it is very worn in places. Not only do these objects provide data on early archery technology and on prehistoric clothing, but the repeated recovery of organic artifacts from melting snow patches also warns of the modifications, rising temperatures, and changing climates that are taking place in these landscapes. Recent years have seen more frequent instances of advanced melting at such sites, and increasing numbers of finds are being recovered both at long-known sites and at new ones. There is clearly a 2.29, 30A hand bow and 2 arrows with slate points lost by Neolithic reindeer hunters on a snow patch in Oppdal, central Norway. The ice and snow have preserved the wood, sinew, and adhesive on these objects for over 5,000 years. Oppdal. Headdresses of felt and leather. There were also rugs, wall coverings, tables laden with food, and horse carcasses complete with elaborate bridles, saddles, and other trappings. A further well-preserved burial has been found in the region, containing a female accompanied by 6 horses and grave goods including a silver mirror and various wooden objects. Similar standards of preservation have also been encountered in other circumpolar regions such as Greenland and Alaska. The permafrost of St. Lawrence Island, Alaska, has yielded the body of an Inuit woman with tattooed arms dating to the early centuries AD. Another example is the well-preserved driftwood ansod house found at Utqiagvik, modern Barrow, on Alaska's north coast, which not only contained the intact bodies of 2 500-year-old Inupiat women and 3 children, but also wood, bone, ivory, feathers, hair, and eggshell. More southerly regions can produce the same effect at high altitude, for instance the Inca mummies found in the Andes, or the 5,300-year-old Iceman found preserved in the ice in the Alps near the border between Italy and Austria. In Greenland, the Inuit bodies of Kilakitsik, dating to the 15th century AD, had also undergone natural freeze-drying in their rock overhang graves protected from the elements. Their tissue had shrunk and become discolored, but tattoos were visible, and their clothes were in particularly fine condition. A more modern example of natural refrigeration can be found in the Arctic graves of 3 British sailors who died in 1846 on the expedition of Sir John Franklin. The bodies were perfectly preserved in the ice of northern Canada's Beechy Island. In 1984, a team led by the Canadian anthropologist Owen Beattie removed samples of bone and tissue for an autopsy, before reburying the corpses. Linked with ongoing weather and climate processes, in central Norway, ancient ice is melting, and alpine permafrost is retreating and becoming shallower. The volume and antiquity of the artifacts being recovered today are unprecedented in the century-long history of regular snow patch surveying in the region. Snow patch archaeology is at the frontline of this issue, and is becoming ever more crucial as it is clear that fragile and precious organic finds, already rare, are being exposed and lost, succumbing to the modern environmental conditions that accelerate decay. Indeed, some climate experts think that all the ice in the Norwegian high mountains will be gone by the end of this century, increasing the urgency of this important work. 2.33 Drawing of part of a Pasaric wall hanging in appliqued felt, preserved by waterlogging and freezing of the organic material, showing a horseman approaching an enthroned figure. 2.31 32 This tunic was found as a crumpled-up piece at circa 1900 m on the Lendbreen Glacier in Norway. Due to sun exposure, the fabric has been unevenly bleached. To preserve the textile, the tunic has been washed carefully in clean water and then freeze-dried at the Museum of Cultural History in Oslo. The fabric is a good example of past exploitation and use of wool. The tunic is woven in a technique called diamond twill, with carefully sorted wool in shades of light beige and dark brown. Coal preservation 3, the Iceman. 2.34, 35 The Iceman, the oldest fully preserved human, as found in 1991, emerging from the melting ice that had preserved him for over 5,000 years. His body has now been scientifically examined using a variety of techniques. The world's oldest fully preserved human body was found in September 1991 by German hikers near the Simmelon Glacier, in the Ötztaler Alps of South Tyrol. They spotted a human body, its skin yellowish-brown and desiccated, at an altitude of 3,200 m. It was 4 days before the body and its accompanying objects were removed by Austrian authorities and taken to Innsbruck University. There were already suspicions that the corpse might be old, but nobody had any idea just how ancient. The Iceman is the first prehistoric human ever found with his everyday clothing and equipment, and possibly going about his normal business. Other similarly preserved bodies from prehistory have been either carefully buried or sacrificed. He truly brings us face to face with the remote past. The body was handed to the Innsbruck Anatomy Department for treatment, after which it was placed in a freezer at -6 degrees Celsius and 98% humidity. Subsequent investigation determined that the corpse, called Simmelon Man, Otzi, or simply the Iceman, had lain c. 90 m inside Italy, and he was returned there, to a museum in Bolzano, in 1998. Considerable work has been carried out on the objects that accompanied the Iceman, and a range of scientific techniques, including scans, X-rays, and radiocarbon dating, have been used to study the corpse itself. 15 radiocarbon dates have been obtained from the body, the artifacts, and the grass in the boots. They are all in rough agreement, falling in a range of 3,365, 2940 BC, averaging at 3,300 BC. The first investigators believed the Iceman was overcome by exhaustion on the mountain, perhaps caught in a fog or a blizzard. After death, he was dried out by a warm autumn wind, before becoming encased in ice. Since the body lay in a depression, it was protected from the movement of the glacier above for 5,300 years, until a storm from the Sahara laid a layer of dust on the ice that absorbed sunlight, finally thawing it out. What did he look like? He was a dark-skinned male, aged in his mid to late 40s. Only about 1.56, 1.6 m tall, his stature and morphology fit well within the measurement ranges of late Neolithic populations of Italy and Switzerland. DNA analysis shows that he had brown hair and brown eyes, was probably lactose intolerant, and that his closest living relatives are on Sardinia and Corsica. The corpse currently weighs only about 54 kilograms. He had severe gum disease, and his teeth are very worn, especially the front incisors, suggesting that he ate coarse ground grain or regularly used them as a tool. There are no wisdom teeth, which is typical for the period, and a marked gap between the upper front teeth. Ötztaler Alps, Italy. When found, he was bald, but hundreds of curly brownish-black human hairs, about 9 centimeters long, which had fallen out after death, were recovered from the vicinity of the body and on the clothing fragments, confirming the DNA analysis. It is possible he had a beard. His right earlobe retains traces of a sharp-edged rectangular depression, where he may have had an ornamental stone fitted. A body scan has shown that his brain, muscle tissues, lungs, heart, liver, and digestive organs were in excellent condition, though the lungs are blackened by smoke, most likely from open fires, and he had hardening of the arteries and blood vessels. Isotopic analysis of his hair suggested that he had been a vegetarian for the last few months of his life, his diet consisting mainly of bread and cereal porridge, but later examination of his stomach contents showed that his last meal was a heavy, greasy mix of ibex meat, wheat bran, and plums. Traces of chronic frostbite were noted in one little toe, and 8 of his ribs were fractured, though these were healed or healing when he died. A fracture to his left arm and severe damage to the left pelvic area occurred during his recovery from the ice. Groups of tattoos, mostly short parallel vertical blue lines, were discovered on both sides of his lower spine, his left calf and right ankle, and his wrists, and he had a blue cross on his inner right knee. These marks, probably made with soot, may be therapeutic, aimed at relieving the arthritis which he had in his neck, lower back, and right hip. His nails had dropped off, but one fingernail was recovered. Its analysis revealed not only that he undertook manual labor, but also that he experienced periods of reduced nail growth corresponding to episodes of serious illness 4, 3, and 2 months before he died. The fact that he was prone to periodic crippling disease supported the view that he fell prey to adverse weather and froze to death. However, it was eventually discovered that an arrowhead in his left shoulder had pierced a major artery, causing a fatal hemorrhage. There were also cuts on his hands, wrists, and ribcage, and a blow to the head either from being struck or a fall, which is probably what finally killed him. It has been claimed that the Iceman was buried on a platform, but some specialists dispute this. Isotopic analyses of the Iceman's teeth and bones, which helped provide evidence of diet, have also been compared with the results found in the water and soil of the region. This study allowed scientists to conclude that he had spent his whole life within about 60 kilometers of the spot where he died. The items found with him, many made of organic materials, preserved by the cold, constitute a unique time capsule of everyday life. A variety of woods and a range of sophisticated techniques of working with leather and grasses were used to create the 70 objects, which add a new dimension to our knowledge of the period. 2.36 The equipment and clothing of the Iceman are like a time capsule of everyday life. Over 70 objects were found associated with him. Bearskin cap. Part 1. The Framework of Archaeology. One of the main concerns of archaeology is the study of artifacts, portable objects made by humans, which provide evidence to help us answer questions about the past. Non-portable artifacts such as hearths and post holes are called features. Locations that show significant traces of human activity, essentially where artifacts and features are found together, are known as archaeological sites. Context is essential to the understanding of past human activity. The context of an artifact consists of its matrix, its provenience, and its association with other artifacts found nearby. Artifacts found where they were originally deposited in the past are said to be in a primary context. Objects that have been moved since their original abandonment through either natural forces or human activity are said to be in a secondary context. Archaeological sites are created through formation processes. Both the deliberate and accidental activities of human beings, such as the building of a structure or the plowing of a field, are called cultural formation processes. Natural events that affect archaeological sites such as volcanic ash covering an ancient city or wind-borne sand burying artifacts are called natural formation processes. Given the correct environmental conditions, an artifact made of any material can survive. Usually inorganic materials such as stone, clay, and metal survive better than organic materials such as bone, wood, or textiles, which tend to decay in all but extreme conditions. The survival of organic materials depends on the matrix that surrounds them and the climate they were deposited in. The acidic soils of tropical climates are the most destructive to organic materials, while dry, desert environments and extremely cold or waterlogged environments are most likely to preserve them. Good introductions to the problems of differential preservation of archaeological materials can be found in Aldhouse Green, M. 2015. Bog Bodies Uncovered, Solving Europe's Ancient Mystery. Thames and Hudson, London and New York. Binford, L.R. 2002. In Pursuit of the Past, Decoding the Archaeological Record. University of California Press, Berkeley and London. Coles, B. and J. 1989. People of the Wetlands, Bogs, Bodies and Lake Dwellers. Thames and Hudson, London and New York. Lilly, M.C. and Ellis, S. 2007. Wetland Archaeology and Environments, Regional Issues, Global Perspectives. Oxbow Books, Oxford. Minoudi, F., and O'Sullivan, A., 2012. The Oxford Handbook of Wetland Archaeology. Oxford University Press, Oxford. Nash, D.T. and Petroglia, M.D. 1987. Natural Formation Processes and the Archaeological Record. British Archaeological Reports, International Series 352, Oxford. Purdy, B.A. 2001. Enduring Records, The Environmental and Cultural Heritage of Wetlands. Oxbow Books, Oxford. Schiffer, M.B. 2002. Formation Processes of the Archaeological Record. University of Utah Press, Salt Lake City. Sheets, P.D. 2006. The Sarin Site, an ancient village buried by volcanic ash in Central America. Wadsworth, Stamford. Further reading. Summary. 3. It has been said that the person with a clear objective and a plan of campaign is more likely to succeed than the person with neither. This is certainly true of archaeology. The military overtones of the words objective and campaign are entirely appropriate for archaeology, which often requires the recruitment, funding, and the coordination of large numbers of people in complex field projects. It is no accident that two pioneers of field techniques, Pitt Rivers and Mortimer Wheeler, were old soldiers. Today, thanks to the impact of such practitioners and the major influence of the new archaeology with its desire for scientific rigor, archaeologists try to make explicit at the outset of research what their objectives are and what their plan of campaign will be. This procedure is called devising a research design, which broadly has 4 stages. 1. Formulation of a research strategy to resolve a particular question or test a hypothesis or idea. 2. Collecting and recording of evidence against which to test that idea, usually by the organization of a team of specialists and conducting of fieldwork, whether survey or excavation or both. 3. Processing and analysis of that evidence and its interpretation in the light of the original idea to be tested. For publication of the results in articles, books, etc., there is seldom, if ever, a straightforward progression from stage 1 to stage 4. In real life, the research strategy will constantly be refined as evidence is collected and analyzed. All too often, and inexcusably, publication may be neglected. But in the best planned research, the overall objective, the broad question or questions to be answered, will stand even if the strategy for achieving it alters. In Part 2, we shall study some of the research strategies archaeologists adopt to answer questions about how societies were organized, what the ancient environment was like, the foods people ate, the tools they made, their trading contacts and beliefs, and indeed why societies evolved and changed over time. Chapter 13 examines 5 projects in detail to show how research is carried out in practice, from start to finish. In this chapter, however, we will focus on stage 2 of the research process, on the methods and techniques archaeologists use to obtain evidence against which to test their ideas. It should not be forgotten that suitable evidence can often come from new work at sites already the subject of fieldwork. Ian Hodder's renewal and reappraisal of the excavations of the Turkish Tel site of Catalhoyuk demonstrates this point. Much potentially rich and rewarding material also lies locked away in museum and institution vaults, waiting to be analyzed by imaginative modern techniques. It is only recently, for example, that the plant remains discovered in Tutankhamun's tomb in the 1920s have received thorough analysis. Yet it remains true that the great majority of archaeological research is still dependent on the collection of new material by fresh fieldwork. Traditionally, fieldwork used to be seen almost exclusively in terms of the discovery and excavation of sites. Today, however, while sites and their excavation remain of paramount importance, the focus has broadened to take in whole landscapes and surface survey at sites in addition to or instead of excavation. Archaeologists have become aware that there is a great range of off-site or non-site evidence, from scatters of artifacts to features such as plow marks and field boundaries, that provides important information about human exploitation of the environment. The study of entire landscapes by regional survey is now a major part of archaeological fieldwork. Archaeologists are becoming increasingly aware of the high cost and destructiveness of excavation. Site surface survey and subsurface detection using non-destructive remote sensing devices have taken on new importance. We may distinguish between methods used in the discovery of archaeological sites and non-site features or artifact scatters, and those employed once those sites and features have been discovered, which include detailed survey and selective excavation at individual sites. WHRE? Survey and excavation of sites and features. One major task of the archaeologist is to locate and record the whereabouts of sites and features. In this section we will be reviewing some of the principal techniques used in site discovery. But we should not forget that many monuments have never been lost to posterity. The massive pyramids of Egypt, or of Teotihuacan near modern Mexico City, have always been known to succeeding generations, as have the Great Wall of China or many of the buildings in the Forum in Rome. Their exact function or purpose may indeed have aroused controversy down the centuries, but their presence, the fact of their existence, was never in doubt. Nor can one credit archaeologists with the discovery of all those sites that were once lost. A significant number of sites known today were found by accident, from the amazing terracotta army of China's first emperor, unearthed in 1974 by farmers digging for a well, to the decorated caves in France of Lascaux and the underwater Cosquer, the entrance to which was discovered by a deep-sea diver in 1985. Along with countless underwater wrecks first spotted by fishermen, sponge gatherers, and sport divers. Construction workers building new roads, subways, dams, and office blocks have made their fair share of discoveries too. For example, the Templo Mayor or Great Temple of the Aztecs in Mexico City. Nevertheless, it is archaeologists who have systematically attempted to record these sites, and it is archaeologists who seek out the full range of sites and features, large or small, that make up the great diversity of past landscapes. How do they achieve this? A practical distinction can be drawn between site discovery conducted at ground level and discovery from the air or from space, although any one field project will usually employ both types of reconnaissance. Ground reconnaissance. Methods for identifying individual sites include consultation of documentary sources and place name evidence, but primarily comprises actual fieldwork, whether the monitoring of building developers' progress in applied or compliance archaeology, or reconnaissance survey in circumstances where the archaeologist is more of a free agent. Documentary sources. We saw how Schliemann's firm belief in the historical accuracy of the writings of Homer led directly to the discovery of ancient Troy in Chapter 1. In the 1960s, the location and excavation by Helga and Steiningstad of the Viking settlement of Landseux. 3.1 partially buried but never lost, buildings in the Forum of ancient Rome, as depicted in an early 19th century painting by the Italian artist Ippolito Caffi. 3.2 The Great Wall of China, over 2,000 kilometers long, was begun in the 3rd century BC. Like the Forum, it has never been lost to posterity. Discovering archaeological sites and features. Meadows in Newfoundland was similarly thanks in large part to clues contained in medieval Viking sagas. Much of modern biblical archaeology concerns itself with the search in the Near East for evidence of the places, people, and events described in the Old and New Testaments. Treated objectively as a possible source of information about Near Eastern sites, the Bible can indeed be a rich source of documentary material. But there is certainly the danger that belief in the absolute religious truth of the texts can cloud an impartial assessment of their archaeological validity. Much research in biblical archaeology involves attempting to link named biblical sites with archaeologically known ones. Place name evidence, however, can also lead to actual discoveries of new archaeological sites. In southwest Europe, for example, many prehistoric stone tombs have been found thanks to old names printed on maps that incorporate local words for stone or tomb. Early maps and old street names are even more important in helping archaeologists work out the former plans of historic towns. In England, it is possible in the better documented medieval towns to map many of the streets, houses, churches, and castles back to the 12th century AD, or even earlier, using this kind of evidence. Such maps then form a reliable basis on which to decide where it would be most profitable to carry out survey work and excavation. Cultural resource management and applied or compliance archaeology. In this specialized work, the role of the archaeologist is to locate and record sites before they are destroyed by new roads, buildings, or dams, or by peat cutting and drainage in wetlands. In the USA, a large number of sites are located and recorded in inventories every year under cultural resource management laws, which were considerably broadened and strengthened in the 1970s. Proper liaison with the developer should allow archaeological survey to take place in advance along the projected line of road or in the path of development. Important sites thus discovered may require excavation, and in some cases can even cause construction plans to be altered. Certain archaeological remains unearthed during the digging of subways in Rome and Mexico City were incorporated into the station architecture. In Britain, as in the USA, most excavations and surveys are undertaken in the context of cultural resource management. The influence of the British National Planning Policy Framework has meant that expenditure on archaeology by developers has grown to £10 million annually. Reconnaissance Survey. How does the archaeologist set about locating sites, other than through documentary sources and salvage work? A conventional and still valid method is to look for the most prominent remains in a landscape, particularly surviving remnants of walled buildings and burial mounds such as those in eastern North America or Wessex in southern Britain. But many sites are visible on the surface only as a scatter of artifacts and thus require more thorough survey, what we may call reconnaissance survey, to be detected. Furthermore, in recent years, as archaeologists have become more interested in reconstructing the full human use of the landscape, they have begun to realize that there are very faint scatters of artifacts that might not qualify as sites, but which nevertheless represent significant human activity. Some scholars have therefore suggested that these off-site or non-site areas, that is, areas with a low 3.3 the low mounds at Lanceaux Meadows turned out to be the remains of huts with walls and roofs of turf supported by a wood frame. Those seen here have been reconstructed for visitors. Lack of evidence for rebuilding indicates this was a short-lived settlement. The Sydney Cypress Survey Project. From 1992 to 1998, the Sydney Cypress Survey Project, led by Bernard Knapp and Michael Given of the University of Glasgow, undertook an intensive archaeological survey in a 75 sq.km area in the northern Troodos Mountains of Cyprus. This is an area famed for its copper sulfate ore deposits, exploited as early as the Bronze Age. The project examined the human transformation of the landscape over 5,000 years and placed it in its regional context. An interdisciplinary approach integrated such diverse fields as archaeology, archaeometallurgy, ethnohistory, geomorphology, ecology, GIS, and satellite imagery, without overlooking the human experience of place. Project aims and design. Primary goals of the project were to use archaeological landscape data to analyze the relationship between the production and distribution of agricultural and metallurgical resources through time, and to chart the changing configurations of a complex society and the individuals within it. A multi-stage research design was adopted, and the notion of the site was called into question. A first requirement for the systematic intensive survey strategy was good maps. Enlarged aerial photographs were used to create a base map of the entire survey region. Using the GIS program MapInfo, the photographs were scanned and registered to the UTM grid with grid lines of 100 m spacing superimposed on the base map. The Cypriot Lands and Survey Department assisted by giving GPS readings for survey points in the study area. The analytical unit used was the survey unit itself. Whenever agricultural plots were clearly defined in the field and on the aerial photographs, they formed the basic recording unit. The main survey approach was a transect survey with the following strategies. 1. To walk 50 m wide transects north, south apart, across the survey area at 500 m intervals, in order to obtain a broad systematic sample of the survey area. 2. To use spatial information entered daily into the GIS to determine which topographic, geological, and land use factors may have conditioned the occurrence of exposed cultural materials. 3. To conduct block survey of special interest areas with extensive evidence of early industrial, agricultural, or settlement activities. 4. To investigate, as places of special interest, locales designated by obtrusive remains or high densities of artifacts. In each unit, a representative sample of cultural material was collected: pottery, chipped stone, ground stone, metals, slag, ores and fluxes, glass, and tiles. Other, mainly non-diagnostic material was simply counted and left in the unit. A major component of the SCSP consisted of using GIS-derived thematic maps to illustrate the results of the field counting, collecting, and recording strategy. Pottery was the key analytical aspect in assessing the meaning and significance of the survey units, and pottery data were incorporated into GIS maps. A pottery index, adjusted for ground visibility and